Welcome everyone to the IISS for this event on conflicts and transformation in the Levant with my colleague Emile Hokayem. I can remember having conversations in this hall about 5 years ago, and the consensus seemed to be Assad's finished, he's going to be taken out by the Arab Spring in just the same way that others. Emile, of course, didn't say that even at the time. But what we have today is a very different state of affairs, with Assad looking like a fixture, even though Syria looks a very different state from the one it was in 2010. We have an uneasy relationship between autonomy-seeking Kurds and the Assad regime that's likely to be tested soon. Syrian rebels are looking towards regional patrons to survive, and transnational Shia militias now operate in Iraq, Syria and Lebanon, both guaranteeing and challenging state authority. We have Israel viewing with greater concern the expansion of Iranian power, and Russia has successfully intervened in the region. More generally, we see a competition between powers for influence. To talk us through where the trajectories are pointing and where the region, and indeed swathe of northern Middle East might be going, we have our colleague Emile Hokayem. He's been with the Institute for about 7 years, but in some ways this is a first. This is his welcome to London. He's relocated here after previously being based in our office in Manama. He will speak for about 20-25 minutes. We are on the record, then we'll do Q&A. Emile.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Well, yeah, indeed, this is my first talk in London after my move here. I'm not sure how long I'm going to survive. I'm known as the purveyor of bad news because I work on the Middle East. And my colleagues are already a bit fed up about the stream of pessimistic information and news I provide on a daily basis. But I thank them for their patience. Every time I talk on the Middle East, I struggle with where to start because it's quite difficult to figure it out. So the easy way out is to blame it all on Sykes-Picot and say, let's go have a drink and be done with that. But the reality is that the convergence of local, transnational, and regional dynamics that we see now are really point to what I would say. I mean, we're really in the middle of a great regional transformation across the northern Middle East. I call it the Levant because as Levantine tend to be hegemonic people, so we like to believe that anything up there is the Levant. I think Iraqis and Iranians wouldn't really like that either. But the point here is that we're really in the middle of something quite fundamental in terms of the politics and the security of the region, in terms of which regional state asserting themselves based on which principles, based on the power of transnational forces. We'll talk about this in a second. Based on some demographic engineering and change that's happening. Based on the nature of external intervention in the region that is pretty straightforward in terms of asserting interests. It's no longer about defending a specific order or defending norms of behavior, or whether it's humanitarian or chemical weapons, etc. The reality is that this has been going on for some time. Certainly, the Iraq War was a catalyst for a lot of that. The ingredients were there. I wouldn't blame the Iraq War for everything. I just think that the ingredients were there. They just needed someone to just kick that mess for all these forces to express themselves. But what has happened, especially since 2011, has really accelerated and accentuated all that. And in a way, the rise of ISIS should have been a moment of clarity, except that I think that what happened with the rise of ISIS is that we began to simplify or in a way oversimplify dynamics. And that's largely because of how I think the US and others approached it. That was the first problem to address, in the hope that other regional and local actors will fall in line, agree that this is a monster to fight, and somehow, there will be a local equilibrium, a balance that will be reached because everyone agrees that ISIS is the ultimate demon. There was a disagreement over others, but that's it. Now, we've entered the post-ISIS era, and the dust is settling, where we're seeing victors and losers emerging. We see the resurfacing of old fault lines. We see the emergence of new fault lines. What's important to understand here is that the fight against ISIS was not primarily about ISIS for local and regional actors. After the first existential moment, yes, it was about ISIS back in May, June, July, August, September 2014. But very quickly, the fight against ISIS became primarily a vehicle of regional competition. I mean, there was an understanding that, if you jumped into the fight against ISIS, you were actually jumping in a race to capture important territory, to stake claims in the region that would actually benefit you in the greater struggle in the region. We'll talk about the Kurds in a second. We'll talk about the Assad regime, about the rebels, about a variety of other actors who opportunistically position themselves on this point. So, and the problem is that the weaker ISIS became and the lesser territory it controlled, the more competition and the more brinksmanship there is. I mean, this is exactly what we're seeing today and what we've seen in the past 6 months, is that the smaller ISIS becomes the more important is for the various actors to articulate publicly their claims, to actually plant a flag, to try to push back against other counter-ISIS forces, to try to contain them. And that's essentially the great game that's happening in northern Iraq, in eastern Syria, in northern Syria, northwestern Syria as well, etc. And that's the situation we're in today, massive brinksmanship. The point is that the fight against ISIS was not a factor of unification and de-escalation against the region. And if anything, I think it actually, and certainly what I'm saying is not a case for doing nothing against ISIS. I'm very glad there was an intervention against it. What I'm saying is that we shouldn't be complacent about where we got after this massive effort. So the post-ISIS Middle East, almost post-ISIS Middle East, is rife with low-intensity rivalries, local and regional, that could escalate pretty badly in the short to medium term. And at this point, I'm not sure we have the right combination of external influence and regional wisdom to try to contain that. So let's take a broad look at this region and try to break down those various battlefields, to try to understand what's happening and the strategic implications that we're seeing. First, Syria, my personal heartbreak and certainly intellectual obsession. Syria, if we were back in 2011, 2012 and discussing it and talking about how Turkey or the Gulf states or others saw it, it was seen as a price, as a potential price. You jump into that struggle and you think that Assad is done and that his regional and international supporters won't come to the rescue, and if they do, they won't necessarily transform the battlefield, to what I would call an arena since 2014. Syria is no longer seen by Turkey or by the Gulf states or others as a geopolitical price. Today, what are you winning in Syria? Just the most horrific, massive humanitarian tragedy of recent times. But it is an arena. Because everyone else is involved, you have to be involved. You have to push for it. And you do so in pretty frustrating ways. You no longer have the instruments that you thought at one point you had. Your proxies, your partners are exhausted. The main aspect of the fight, which was Assad versus the rebellion, is now slowly decreasing in importance, at least in policy terms. And from all we know today, looking at the very fundamentals of that conflict, Assad will survive in the foreseeable future, which is a defeat for a number of regional actors. And Assad has every interest in capturing as much territory as he can now. he has no interest in playing nice or really abiding by what we call the escalation agreements, or what the Russians are trying to broker, etc. He has actually every interest in using the Russian dominance of the battlefield in the absence of the Americans to freeze conflict where he needs it to be freeze, so he can actually focus on the territory he wants to capture and then change again. And this is something we've seen quite often in the past, since the fall of Aleppo, since December. And the reality is that after Russia, Iran, Assad defeated the mainstream opposition, because it's a defeat. I mean, today there is absolutely no viable, realistic political or military path for victory for the rebellion. Assad is generally fighting the jihadis. Finally, I mean, if this were really the focus of the Russian effort and others in 2015, they would have agreed to a nationwide ceasefire, and everyone would have directed their guns at Jabhat al-Nusra, at ISIS, etc. That's not what happened from 2015 till late 2016, early 2017. But now that's the fight, and that's the fight because the jihadis, primarily ISIS in the east, and now as well Nusra in Idlib, in western Aleppo province, in Hama, and so on. This is strategic territory today. I mean, once you've captured eastern Aleppo, once you've freed Damascus from rebel pressure from Ghouta and elsewhere, you have the space. You need to go and capture that, and in doing so, you're actually winning the approval of the assent or the acquiescence of a number of Western or Middle Eastern countries that were opposed to you, because that's the agreement, is that the jihadis are a threat to be defeated. There is no prospect for a political transition in Syria anytime soon. I mean, the Geneva process, I'm sad to say, is a farcical sideshow. It's a useful one. It's an expedient, convenient one. A number of governments hide behind the pretense of a process because, you pretend you're putting conditionality, that, that's your policy when there's no real policy. A weak process that doesn't have much leverage into it. At the same time, I would argue that process is necessary to at least keep parts of the opposition on board, so that there is no massive dejection and abandonment that would actually work in favor of the more hardline elements who say, look, I mean, jumping into a UN process that was Western backed and supposedly internationally backed led us nowhere. I mean, they took us on a ride. They took them on a ride. I mean, that's sure, but diplomats and officials won't say as much. I'm an analyst, so I can say pretty much whatever I want. So that's one of them. So what's happening is that Russia is essentially in managing the regional and even local rivalries at this point through the Astana process, through bilateral relations, for instance, with Turkey or Jordan, and through tactical deals with the US. I wouldn't, perhaps not deals, let's call it understandings or arrangements. That's because, dominating on the battlefield matters. So when your Western governments for years you say there's no military solution, it's all going to end up with a deal, etc., and then the other side doesn't necessarily agree and pursue their military approach, and then they win on the battlefield, then they get to actually have enough leverage, influence, credibility with parties, including rival parties, to broker all that. So I mean, today, I think tomorrow, King Salman of Saudi Arabia lands in Moscow for the first ever visit by a Saudi monarch to Russia. Look back at Saudi or Russian newspapers from a couple of years ago and see the accusations left and right. I mean, the senior most Russian officials would call the Saudis all kind of names, and the other way around. Well, in this new Middle East where the U.S. is retrenching, power matters. I mean, the perception of power matters. And that's a bit what's happening. Countries rethinking who gets to call the shots, who gets to manage and de-escalate those conflicts. The result, what we have in Syria, is an ongoing self-partition of the country, where essentially zones of influence across the territory. The US, Russia, Turkey, Jordan, Iran, all have a claim over either territory or groups, etc. And the question is how they regulate that competition, whether they can agree on those rules. I would say that it's self-partition, but the edge is, but Assad does have the edge. He does control a contiguous, relatively, obviously, viable territory. As he said in a speech a few weeks ago, he controls also, thanks to the war, he controls a homogeneous population. Essentially, Assad had pursued a strategy of depopulation. You basically kick out the elements who are disloyal to you. You don't have to provide for their needs, etc. They become a burden on other countries. And at home, you basically control those who either were loyal or were accepting or abiding by your rule. So a smaller population, easier to maintain, a population that recognizes, that reads international and local politics and understands that he's a victor. So they won't be, contrary to what a lot of people think, I don't think they will be a massive challenge to Assad rule from now on. There will be the jihadi groups, etc. But on territory he controls, the roots of the conflict won't be addressed. But there will be no appetite or resources or energy for something that is sustainable. I mean, we're not talking about, it's not going to be a high-level insurgency against him in those territories. I think it will be a low to medium level, but probably a low-level one as well. And if you're Assad, you also know that regional and international powers no longer seek your ouster. So in a way, you have escalation dominance. You can always push them. You know that they're not going to go all the way. They may bomb you here and there, and you may not agree, but you're no longer worried about your survival. It's not that the Turks or the Jordanians or the Americans are going to do anything at this point to push back. So, you can play the incremental game on that one. The other region that we talk about a lot is the Rojava, or the Kurdish areas that stretch from the Iraqi border to not to Afrin, obviously, to Jarablus, and then there's the territory that Turkey controls, the Euphrates River territory, and then there's Afrin. That territory is homogeneous. It's actually expanding. I would argue perhaps too much for the Turks, for the Kurds' own good, unless what they have in mind is that we capture more territory and then we make deals. We offer the territory we just captured precisely to reach an arrangement with the regime, to show that we're magnanimous, that we're not saying. The problem for that, with that territory and for the Kurds of Syria today, is that they are dependent on US support and protection. And they're not just dependent against one enemy. They're, obviously, ISIS is their primary enemy in the battle today, but the real strategic threats are two. On one hand, the Syrian regime, if it decides to escalate and it feels that the Iranians, Shia militias, the Russians are on board with that. But second, against Turkey. And that is the strategic hiccup for the Americans, is that you basically, you have a partner on the ground that thinks that you will defend them against a strategic treaty ally, which is Turkey. And I think the Americans still don't know what they want to do on this. I mean, obviously, Bert McGurk is the viceroy of Syria and Iraq, so probably he's figured out in his head. I just don't think that you can actually deal with this very easily. I don't think withdrawing from Rojava is going to be an easy matter. So this is a territory that is extremely complex to navigate. And look, for instance, what happened in the past couple of weeks. The shock among some in Washington and other Western capitals when the Russians and the Assad regime and others crossed the Euphrates River south of Deir ez-Zor. I mean, there was a sense that, oh, no, we had agreed on the confliction zone, etc. Well, that's partly because we're very good at building illusions in our head and hoping that the other party will abide by them as well. And when you don't have a level of deterrence, if you don't have credibility on the battlefield, etc., well, they call on you. And when that happens, you can't do anything. You can't necessarily escalate. So, for instance, the Assad regime or the Russian Air Force have actually bombed SDF units recently on the eastern side of the Euphrates River, but there was no response that I know of on this front. Now, who's the geopolitical winner in this regionally? I would say, the Iranians are ahead. They showed that commitment, expertise, experience, strategic patience pays off. They were able to demonstrate that they stand by their friends in good and bad times, contrary to, for instance, the Gulf states, who actually are largely pulling the plug on that. That matters. Put aside whether you agree or disagree with this side or that side, who's the more reliable partner? And that's a key matter, because that's going to shape how the actors are going to behave in the future period. I would argue that Iran today is the dominant power in the region from Iran to Lebanon. I'm not saying the only power that plays across those battlefields, but it's certainly in a much better position. Iran's partnership with Russia worked out much better than people believed. Yes, there were some operational divergences and so on, but what matters is that this partnership is actually morphing into something even greater, because those two countries realized that their partnership is a force multiplier. They've challenged the US order in the region. They have been able to operationally, militarily perform quite well on the ground. They've seen, and especially if you're in Moscow, you see all these Arab states that were, wary about, your ambitions and so on for years, actually now rush to Moscow. A very senior Arab official once told me, I don't like what Putin does, but I like how he does it. And I think it tells you something about the perception of power. It does matter in the region how you look and how you behave. And Obama was very professorial and everything, but couldn't make a decision on these issues. And to the 2013 chemical weapons debacle is always raised in meetings there. In comparison, Putin looks very tough. So if you're and ruthless and committed and so on. So those are choices and trade-offs that people in the region think about, regardless of how they feel about the Russian intervention on that one. And the other point about Iran being a geopolitical winner is that it controls ground in Syria. I mean, I think one of the problems we have is not understanding to what extent having people on the ground shapes local behavior, civilian behavior, not just on the military side. Iran today is in a position where its militias can rebuild roads, facilitate trade, movements of goods, of people, etc. And that helps you get embedded in the local population, a population that is exhausted by conflict. So the Americans at one point were thinking about whether to check Iran in the eastern parts of Syria, in Tanf, and those areas, and even further to the north. And my point is, if you don't have the people on the ground who the significant numbers of people who are controlling it, engaging with the local population, and so on, you're basically talking about forts in the middle of nowhere just to conduct specific military operations. That's not really sustainable, and that's not going to be strategically significant on the battlefield. Another advantage for Iran is that it has managed to build more secure and diverse supply lines into Lebanon today. A lot of people have derided this notion of a corridor, a land corridor between Iran and Lebanon, saying, oh, that's hyped, and Iran used to be able to supply Hezbollah through airways and so on. I mean, really, people, if you ultimately having your logistics also on the ground means that you can have more of it, it's cheaper, you can hide it a lot better. You're not as easily identified in the air. You have many more options and so on. And that matters on a battlefield like this one. We're talking about a battlefield that is today dominated by transnational militias, including, and I think most importantly, I get to it, transnational Shia militias, who I actually today think are the main driver of conflict in the region, of current and future conflict in the region. And by getting into Lebanon, by getting into southern Syria, Iran has been able today to build a second front against Israel. Israel was hoping that Russia could prevent that from happening, and actually Israel asked Putin to try to negotiate with the Iranians a 60-kilometer deep, zone where Iranians and Hezbollahis and others wouldn't operate. Putin turned down this, and I think at this point the understanding is 5 kilometers. But the point here, Putin basically gave them freedom of operation from the air, which I think is, one way for the Russians to, navigate those delicate politics between the two. But it's not going to matter much in the long term, to be honest, because you need to have great intelligence, you have to have, constant air superiority, air presence, and so on. It is going to be difficult to counter the Iranian buildup in southern Syria. Now, who are the geopolitical losers? I mentioned them earlier. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about Turkey. I think there will be a lot of questions about this later. But I think the prime ones are the Gulf states. Here Saudi, and primarily because it's the large power, but also Qatar. I think for Saudi in particular, Saudi since 2015 has been engaged in a massive, very destructive conflict in Yemen. And Yemen is important for Saudi security. It's a large country sitting on its border, etc. But Yemen is not central, it's actually peripheral to the regional balance of power. If that's your goal, this is what you're announcing, being descriptive here. If you want to do something about Iran, you have to do it in the central Middle East. In Syria, in Iraq, where Saudi failed to engage since 2003, has only sent an ambassador 2 years ago. Now, the relationship is developing quickly, but the Iranians have an edge. Their economy, they're very present inside Iraq, not just politically or militarily, but also at the human, societal level, economic level. A lot of Iraqis are actually grateful for that. So, it does have an edge. And I think the combination of the Russian intervention that really spooked the Gulf states, provoked a Turkish shift starting 2016, and led to a U.S. basically de-escalation and retrenchment, has had a huge impact about how the Gulf states see that. They basically say, we have especially Saudi, we have tense relations with Turkey, given the Muslim Brotherhood, the role with Qatar, a million other things. We can't use Jordan anymore because Jordan is essentially abiding by Russian wishes in southern Syria. We have no way of mattering in Syria anymore. So essentially, they don't have much to. In comparison, Yemen is important for their security, but it's a high-cost, low-return intervention, and they're feeling it now. It's going to be very difficult for the Saudis to extricate themselves from this, and I think that they should do it urgently and unilaterally, de-escalate and just prioritize humanitarian relief and just get a UN process, going and say, we just declare victory, whatever you want, deal with your border. But, at this point, the Saudi intervention in Yemen has been very destructive and costly. The fourth battlefield is Iraq. Very complex picture. I'm not going to spend too much time because I guess a lot of questions will revolve around Iraq. And I would like to mention that tomorrow we're hosting the Chief Justice of Iraq, Faik Zaidin, the new one. I really recommend that you attend this one. He's just been recently appointed, very senior and very crucial to some of the new post-ISIS mechanisms there. So come if you want. The event is online. What's happening in Iraq today is, essentially very interesting and very intense political wrangling ahead of next year's elections. Abadi can claim, some glory, some, satisfaction from the Mosul operation, and obviously there is a lot of pride in Iraq for this. But there's also a level of exhaustion in the forces, a level of, the forces, the Iraqi security forces have taken, a lot of hits for the Mosul victory. Number one. Number two, he has to run on a pretty diverse slate. I mean, imagine Abadi plus Sadr plus communists. I mean, that's not the most obvious political platform there, but they're running on a platform of reform and kind of reconciliation and so on. But the problem for Abadi today is that the timing and the manner of the Kurdish referendum forces him to look tougher, to actually make no compromises. Because if he shows any weakness in the run-up to the elections, he's going to be very vulnerable for attacks from more hardline actors in Iraq, including Maliki, and we see this. So there is actually an incentive for brinksmanship there. And I think there is a possibility of conflict. I wouldn't say it's medium to high. I say it's low to medium in northern Iraq, but it's there. And I think the Kurds of Iraq will realize that, for all the sympathy they get in the West and elsewhere, if Turkey, Iran, Iraq agree that this is unacceptable, they don't necessarily have to resort to armed conflict. They can make the life of Iraq's Kurds pretty miserable, and that's a very big deal. Now, let me end with something that's close to my heart, Lebanon. And you have to see what's happening in Lebanon, what's happening in northern Syria and eastern Syria, what's happening in northern Iraq, as like it's a continuity of conflicts. Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, a couple of days ago threatened the Kurds of Iraq. And that shows you today that there are local actors that have an ability to threaten coercion, to move troops, to operate on different battlefields in pretty fluid ways. In Lebanon, the objective conditions for a future devastating conflict are met. I mean, very objectively, if you look at the battlefield, if you look at, the readiness of the various actors, if you look at military exercises and so on, it is plausible and possible that in the foreseeable future there will be an escalation. Now, this time, contrary to 2006, you don't have, George Bush or Jacques Chirac talking about Lebanon all the time, and a distinction between the Lebanese government and Hezbollah and the Lebanese military. If you're Israel, you don't see those differences, those nuances anymore. And the Americans are quite disengaged from all that, so they're not in a position to manage and de-escalate that conflict. So I'm very worried that a future conflict that may not happen because of a decision, but because of a miscalculation and misinterpretation, can actually escalate quite a lot. And that wouldn't be a conflict just on the Lebanese-Israeli border. It would be also on the Syrian Israeli border, including the Golan Heights, etc. So basically, Israel would have to man a front that is twice as long as before. And on the Syrian side, much more ambiguous. And in June, Hassan Nasrallah gave a speech in which he told the Lebanese, "Don't worry for the next war. We're not going to be defeated because we will invite tens of thousands of fighters from," and he proceeds to list Yemen, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, and just add those things, who will join the fight, which shows you the importance of this underappreciated element of conflicts, a factor of conflict, transnational Shia militias today. It is factored in the contingency planning, the military planning of most local actors in the region. They are state-backed, they are they're better organized, better armed, they're hardened, they operate across conflict, they have their logistics figured out, and they're deployable. They're deployable against the Kurds in Iraq, against the Kurds in Syria, against Israel in Lebanon, southern Syria. And our focus on ISIS, which is totally understandable given the global nature of the ISIS terrorist threat, blinded us to the strategic nature the rise of transnational Shia militias. Let me end here. Thank you for your attention, and sorry for speaking too much. Thank you for not throwing anything at me. Thank you.
Hassan, PhD student at King's College London. Thank you very much for the very interesting expose. You mentioned Lebanon. A few years ago, Hezbollah was severely castigated locally in Lebanon, but also regionally for its involvement in the Syrian conflict. Would you say today that Hezbollah has emerged stronger? There seems to be some alarm in the Israeli press that Hezbollah's missile inventories have grown. There are isolated reports that Hezbollah has already begun bringing in Iraqi Shia militia members into Lebanon. Are those true, or is that Israeli alarmism, in your opinion?
Thank you. And then Sheena, if we can go down to man by the mirror.
Question about
Wait for the microphone. It's coming.
Question about al-Hashd al-Sha'bi. Now the fighting is coming to an end in Hawija. How do you see them being used next against the Kurds in Syria, particularly given the dynamics about how they might be, the different elements within al-Hashd al-Sha'bi might be trying to towards the Iraqi elections, where they'll be looking to become political actors as well. I've also been asked to throw a quick question in about Palestine and the recent deal between Fatah and Hamas, and whether there's any prospects for success with that. Thank you.
Your name and affiliation? Just so
Certainly. Barry Marston, formerly Foreign Office, currently working for Promo 7.
Thank you very much. I think there was another one here. Virginia at the front, please. And then we'll go back to Emile.
Thank you. Virginia Comolli from the IISS. Emile, you made reference to the fact that local leaders admire, or at least appreciate, Putin's strongman approach as opposed to Obama's professorial stance. Can you shed some light on how they perceive the current US administration and how they view Trump? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. So let me start with the first question on Lebanon and Hezbollah. Look, the fight was costly for Hezbollah. There's no doubt about it. But I think Hezbollah was always and fundamentally a regional actor stuck in Lebanon. Hezbollah always saw itself as greater than Lebanon, better than Lebanon. It resented the constraints of the Lebanese system, the dysfunction, the corruption, or whatever. I mean, I'm talking about their self-image. So in a way, the Syrian war, yes, was damaging, but it also allowed Hezbollah to fully express itself as a regional actor, and that's what it is today. It is a senior actor. It may have less fighters than others, because it's a smaller one, but than other Shia militias. But it's more senior. It's better. It's better organized. It has prestige because of the fight against Israel. And it did build up its forces. I mean, it does have a greater arsenal of rockets. It probably has its own workshops at this point. I mean, all these are very credible allegations. So what it lost in terms of image, because of its involvement, because of the perception in the region that it has behaved as a sectarian actor in support of Assad, etc., it has gained, these are intangibles for Hezbollah. It has gained something very tangible. It has gained territory. It has gained new fighters. It something very, very solid. So I think on balance, if you're Hezbollah, you think that it was worth it. It was painful, but it was worth it. And look at the return. You actually dominate the politics and the security of Lebanon. You operate everywhere. You have a claim to victory. I always found, this notion that Hezbollah would lose massive support. I mean, it did lose support, but it did not in a debilitating way, because that doesn't matter that much at the end of the day. This is a strongly organized, committed, ideological organization, and they got their way. The issue of the Hashd, look, I mean, the Hashd is probably one of the most, it's a very diverse umbrella, and we have to be careful not to see, and I'm not saying you did, I'm just talking in general, the Hashd it's not just Iranian-backed militias. You do have others that have organized and rallied because of the Sistani call back in 2014, and in a way, the Sistani call was essential to avoid, straightforward sectarian bloodletting and so on. I mean, so and those militias have played a role, and from everything we know in Iraq, a lot of them still abide by what Sistani wants, and we see Sistani's attempts to de-escalate some of the current crisis, try to tip the balance against the Khazali and brothers and Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis and all these things, in support of Abadi. I mean, I think that's what he's comfortable with today. So the Hashd is going to behave very differently. I mean, the point today is that it wants to be. The Hashd wants to be formalized, and it is getting formalized. There's a number of laws that are passing. The fighters require demand salaries. They don't want to be integrated in the conventional forces. They're going to be part of the economy. They're going to be part of the politics. I think we have to wait until the elections to see if they're able to translate the prestige of the battlefield into votes. And I suspect, look at the pushback against Iran in Iraq today. It's very interesting because it's organic. I remember like 15 years ago when we were studying Iraq and talking about transformation in Iraq, we always had the question, can the Americans understand how to empower Najaf against Qom? Like, you think the Americans can do that, or any foreign actor? It has to be something organic. When you have Hakim basically striking a more independent path, when you have Sadr, also, going on a new trajectory, when you have all this dissent that is to some extent, when Shahroudi comes to Iraq, visits Iraq, and is snubbed by part of the religious and political establishment, it shows you that the pushback is going to be organic. It's not something that external actors can do. I think external actors have done their share of mistakes. I think 2010 was a good moment. So we have to wait a bit more. I'm not going to speculate too much on that. But militarily, it's undeniable that the Iranian-backed Hashd units are still better armed and better organized, and see themselves as part of a broader organization across the Middle East. The question about Palestine, look, I'm not going to answer it for a couple of reasons. The first one is that I don't study Israel-Palestine. Mm-hmm. The second one is my wife is Palestinian, so she decides what the line is on this, and I listen very carefully. Kidding on that one, but it's really not my specialty. And then the question of the Arab perception of Trump. I think at least in official and elite circles across the Arab world, there was the state of Obama. I mean, it was not just disagreement, or once it almost became personalized, which actually was very, very unhealthy to do so. There's some policy decisions that one can criticize or support as whatever, but in a way, he validated for a lot of them a lot of prejudices and preconceptions that they had all this. That Obama was fundamentally trying to reorient U.S. policy away from traditional Arab allies. That the Iran deal is evidence of that. That the failure to carry through in 2013 shows that the U.S. wants to retrench that. And I think analytically, there are some valid points in all this. I'm not sure about the totality. I don't think that Obama wanted to realign with Iran towards saying. But in 2016, Obama gave an interview to The Atlantic in which he said that Saudi Arabia and Iran should share the region. As both an analyst and someone from the region, I would say this is the worst possible way of framing it. If anything, the region needs less of Iran and less of Saudi Arabia. It's not about sharing the region. It's actually about figuring out a way where both can actually decrease their involvement. But that, I think, conceptually, analytically, this is where Obama got it wrong, but that really rang alarm bells in Gulf capitals and Arab capitals and so on. So Trump comes and, looks like the very opposite. And in, I think, Arab minds, they built up Trump as, the guy we can do business with. He doesn't care about human rights. He's anti-Muslim Brotherhood. He has this, really tough line on Iran and all this. So, yes, they did build him up as the best news they could ever get from Washington. The problem is, I think I don't think Trump knew what he was talking about when he was saying it. Was just it's instinctive, but there's no. I don't see the substance, the policy on all these. It's he doesn't like stuff, but it doesn't necessarily mean he knows why and what to do with his dislike of it. I mean, and we see that in the whole debate today about the Iran nuclear deal. I think the deal is good. The issue is not with the deal. The issue is with the broader policy. Is there one or not? So a lot of Arabs, really believe that they were going to get what they want out of Trump, and they're not going to get it. And even if he kind of agrees with them, we saw this, for instance, in the Saudi UAE crisis with Qatar. Trump did, rhetorically side with Saudi and the UAE, but politically, the effort is led by people who actually want to de-escalate this crisis, see this as a distraction, as a problem, etc. So if you're in Riyadh or in Abu Dhabi, you're really wondering, did we misinterpret what the guy said? Did we have really high expectations and betray them, etc.? And then on the issue of Iran, we still are waiting for a policy. We know that he doesn't like the nuclear deal, but he's not telling us how he would fix it first. I don't think it really needs fixing. It needs better implementation. And all nuclear experts agree that this is a good deal, so, almost all. But the second thing is on the region. If Trump gave an interview in which he said, in Syria, I have an ISIS-only approach. Well, okay, if you have an ISIS-only approach and you accept what I said earlier, that Syria is what is central to the regional balance of power, then there is a problem. You're not trying to affect the regional balance of power. Therefore, you don't have a real policy. You're working on the margin. So I think Arab officials are learning the hard way that, Trump is not going to deliver on any front.
Okay. We have 3 questions in this part of the room. Could we go Ben Barry first, please?
Just an observation, just as there's a political asymmetry between the Iranian, Russian, Hezbollah and supporting Assad and the US-led coalition supporting the Iraqi government and anti-ISIS forces, there's a military asymmetry. The US talk about buy through with, they've got people on the ground but not particularly far forward, making enormous efforts to try and reduce civilian casualties and collateral damage, although President Trump has allowed a relaxation of that. But what's really interesting is what you might call the Iranian model, which has many similar features but is much harder. They're prepared to send their forces much further to the front line, and the Iranian, Russian and Hezbollah casualties are hard evidence of that. They're much less concerned with civilian casualties, and they're also prepared to raise militia forces and employ them as well. And I think that's had, in terms of their strategy, it's had real benefits on the ground, and it'd be interesting to see what regional actors make of both those different models in the fullness of time.
Thank you. If Tom McCain would be so kind as to be the middle man in the relay, gentleman on the aisle, please.
Charles Vivian, a member of the Institute. Emile, thank you very much for some very incisive comments. They were great. Could I ask you to expand a bit on the strategic implications of the referendum among the Iraqi Kurds? I mean, what will be the impact on their oil production? Do they actually want independence, or do they want a great deal of autonomy? What will be the impact on the other Kurds in the other states and issues such as those?
And the gentleman, if you pass it to the gentleman behind you, please.
Yes, Mohammed Sulami from Arabian Gulf Center for Iranian Studies. I have 2 questions, very short. First question is, how do you assess the the deal between Hezbollah and ISIS in the Al-Jarud area between Syria and Lebanon, and why they didn't. I mean, Hezbollah sent handed over the fighters from ISIS to the security in Lebanon, the government. I mean, this is the first question. The second question, maybe related to what the gentleman has said about the future of relation between Iran and Russia about in terms of the Syrian crisis. Do they have different strategies in Syria, or will kind of fighting in the future? Just a very short observation about balance of power in the region, and Saudi should focus on Yemen and Syria more than Yemen. I think if we put ourselves in the position of Saudi, there is a direct and immediate threat in our southern border with Yemen as a Saudi, and then we forget that and think about Syria, I think wouldn't be accepted inside Saudi. And also, Saudi cannot tolerate the presence of Iranian Revolutionary Guard in their border. Thank you.
And if you pass the microphone to your left, we'll just add one more this round, David Butter.
Thank you, David Butter, Chatham House Associate Fellow. I had a question about the eastern Euphrates, east of Euphrates space in Syria, and the viability of what seems to have been sketched in from the Americans as a new kind of governance model. We're talking about regional councils, military councils, and so on. So this isn't necessarily a Kurdish political governance issue, it's an Arab tribal political governance issue. And it seems to have been reasonably successful so far in terms of the advances they've made and the assets they've got on the eastern Euphrates, Deir ez-Zor, and eventually probably Raqqa. And linked to that, I think it's also striking, and I wonder what your view on this is, that you've got a much more active Russian involvement in the Deir ez-Zor campaign and not such a prominent Iranian involvement in that theatre, or what you might see as being behind that.
Okay.
Nice and easy.
Easy. First, Ben, totally agree with you on the different military models, etc. The point on top of all this, it's the credibility and the commitment that comes with being aligned with Iran in particular that makes a huge difference. I mean, the US discontinued, and the UK for that matter, its support for mainstream rebel groups fighting Assad, and that actually happened a few months ago before it was officially announced two months ago. This is going to have a huge impact in the future. That today, I mean, if I were to talk to a Syrian rebel commander, I would tell him, don't listen to the Americans. Do what you need to do for survival. You want to make a deal with the Assad regime, you want to align with someone else, don't listen to the Americans. And what I'm trying to say here is that being there for your partners in good and bad times is what makes the Iranians more successful in those places, where others, I mean, that applies to the Americans, it applies to also others in the region, Turkey, Jordan, etc. That is a fundamental difference. People have long memories. They'll think about this. It will be much harder on the next round of fighting, because if people think that's the end of it, let's meet in 10, 15 years. I mean, this conflict is not going to end in a peaceful, sustainable, inclusive way. There'll be a lot of resentment, and that's going to be a problem to shape, the nature of the future disposition of power. The Kurdish referendum. Look, I understand Kurdish grievances and aspirations. Like the chauvinism, the denial of their cultural, political rights for decades by centralized Arab states has been, really problematic, and I'm being very polite here, and so on. The Kurds got to that moment where, when I interview some of them and so on, it's like, if it's not now, when? We spilled our blood, we did everything, we don't see real change in approach from central governments. We see Assad racing towards the north, we see the Hashd building up its reserve. That's the moment where the world still remembers our contribution in the fight against ISIS. This is why we have the sympathy, we have to do it. Now, that's one part of the discourse. The other part is that it was also motivated because of internal Kurdish politics, with Barzani, a level of dysfunction, a question about the legitimacy of the parliament, of the president himself, etc. So that was really a way for Barzani and others to claim the mantle of Iraqi Kurdish leadership at that moment. So, these things never happen for just one reason. It's always a convergence of factors that do that. I think, in a way, the referendum is not legally binding, and I think there was a mistake in how we talked about it. We could have told the Kurds, look, the referendum is, we're questioning the wisdom of the referendum, not the merits, but we know that the referendum is not legally binding. So what we oppose is the independence, not the referendum itself. Okay, let that thing go on, and we'll do that. But with the rhetorical escalation, with the White House statements and the Iranian statements, etc., everyone cornered themselves in a way. So actually, if you're Kurdish today, I think before they would have used the result of the referendum to obtain more rights, play hardball with the central government. It would have been a difficult diplomacy, but I think there are reasonable people in Baghdad and elsewhere who could have reached the deal. Now I think it's going to be much more difficult. And to see Iraqi forces be deployed on the Iraqi-Turkish border through Turkey, I mean, it shows you that the main state players have levers. They have ways of striking deals, etc. There was a time when Barzani and Erdogan had a good relationship. I'm not sure about that anymore. How do the Kurds export their oil? The airspace issue. Who's going to invest in this place? It's going to be extremely difficult. The impact on the region, well, that's what is motivating the Turks and the Iranians. The images from Iran were quite striking. I won't say that the numbers of Kurds in Iran demonstrating was massive. I think there's potential for a lot more, but the idea is there. But to be honest, I would also look at the Syrian Kurds. The Syrian Kurds are in the same position. It's like, this may be the moment of making a big political statement, establishing ourselves. This is the moment where we have the legitimacy, the sympathy, and so on. Let's push on that. I think it's going to be, the next few months are going to be very difficult, especially because of the election. There is interest in brinksmanship there. Dr. Mohammed, the deal between ISIS and Hezbollah a couple months ago on the Lebanese-Syrian border. Look, I mean, Hezbollah is a pretty cynical actor. Why go and waste blood and time and bullets fighting ISIS or Nusra, for that matter, because there was a deal with Nusra, when you actually can make an agreement, ship them in another region, and have someone else kill them? That's essentially what happened, is that the Nusra fighters were sent to Idlib, and the ISIS fighters were sent to eastern Syria and possibly to Iraq. Let the Americans, let the Iraqis, let others do the nasty work. We have we've met our strategic goal, which is to establish the safe zone for ourselves along the border. We don't necessarily have to fight and spend blood, etc. Second, that was a deal that also served to, in a way, humiliate the Lebanese state. That they are the ones who fight the battle and then make the deal and whatever. And the Lebanese army is trying to find its way. They did do some good things in the battle and so on, but they were not part of the deal. They endorsed it, which is another matter. Look, I think Hezbollah is when it can not fight groups that it knows others will fight it. It will say, count us out. We'll actually focus on our core interests, and that shows you that this is a very smart, formidable organization, because they know precisely what their interests are, and they will pursue them when they need to. Future of relations between Iran and Russia over Syria. Look, when Russia entered the Syrian battlefield a couple years ago, everybody told me, they're not going to agree, their visions are different, the way they work with proxies, etc., there will be clashes and so on. What's important is to understand that this relationship has not just survived, but it has actually grown despite operational differences. And that's the important thing. The tendency in Western policy making circles and Arab policymakers, etc., is to focus on the differences, thinking that these differences offer a policy wedge, and then you can actually separate the two. I don't see it this way. Remember when the whole discussion was about how to separate Assad from Iran up until 2011, and all the money and the ink and whatever that was spent in that? It didn't happen. What's important is they understand that their partnership is a force multiplier. Yes, they don't see a political settlement the same way, but they can live with that. They can, they understand their different interests. Sometimes they're overlapping. Rarely they're really conflicting at this point. They're winning points against the US order in the region, and they're getting other parties to cave to it. So they can rationalize, they can justify their differences. And today they both agree that Assad should survive. So there's agreement on that. They agree on the reform of part of the Syrian military, and so on. So I don't see a big clash in the short to medium term. And finally, David, east of Euphrates politics, modern, etc. Look, you're right. I mean, it's not just Kurdish dominated. The Americans are making deals with local Arab tribes, etc. The point here is, what is your strategic vision here? Because if the Americans are to decrease their presence or involvement in the region and not deal with stabilization and other issues, those councils are likely to either make deals with Assad or join remnants of ISIS. I don't think the second is likely at all. I'm just playing with possibilities. I actually think they will go and find a strong horse, essentially, and say, the world has accepted Assad, so let's make a deal with that. So the Americans will have actually fought a war, spent energy, capital, and whatever, to fight an enemy, ISIS, understandable. But ultimately, this will have benefited what the Americans say is their strategic rival in the region, Assad and Assad. And that's the irony of it, is that by having an ISIS first or almost ISIS only approach to those issues, the Americans have actually gotten entangled in the region. I mean, back in 2013, the reason why Obama said, let's not do the strike, let's get out, is precisely to not be entangled in well, they've actually been, they are very entangled today, and they're on the losing side of all these entanglement. And I don't think those deals are viable without an external party providing cover for that. And the locals who are part of these deals know that. They will look for a protector, even if it's Assad on that one. Finally, the Russian involvement in the Azov versus the Iranian one. Look, the Russians are more involved in the fighting in the Azov on ISIS, but the Iranians and their allies are actually operating to the south of that, precisely to secure this area. So, yes, I mean, the Russians, they lost a three-star general, 10 days ago. That's a huge deal. ISIS has just published pictures of 2 Russian soldiers who were captured. It looks true. Their social media profiles have been found. So, this is not just a propaganda coup or an ISIS lie. They actually have them. So the Russians are fighting ISIS in a much more sustained way today. That's undeniable. But if you look at what's happening in the Homs province and in south of Deir ez-Zor, the city, not the province, the Iranians are very involved, and I think that's strategic. Their goal is to get to the Iraqi border. The question is, who will deploy on the Iraqi side of the border, or will just be ISF forces? Will there be Hashd forces who will move in? Will it be a hybrid group? That's what we're struggling with today.
Okay. We are beyond our hour, but the last time I checked, there were still a lot of hands up. I really don't think I'm going to be able to get through all of them, but I will endeavour to get through a few. Can we start with Dame Glenn Evans, please?
Thank you. Glenn Evans, Constellis Group. I wondered if you could say something about the rebuilding of Syria. There's going to be a case for massive investment to rebuild Syria. I've heard that elements in the Assad regime believe that sanctions are going to be lifted just like that, which is a pretty remote possibility, I would have thought. So does this mean that Iran and Russia, who are not exactly flush with cash, are going to be doing it? How do you see that evolving and when?
Okay. And as gentleman with his hand raised there, and then...
Really Sword from SC
later.
Strategy.
Okay.
I was wondering how you think this might impact on the relationship between Israel and the Gulf. There has been the Bahraini king recently talking about improving relations and some probably unfounded rumours about the Saudi king or relations going to Israel. But yeah, do you think that's going to bring them closer together?
And then Tom McCain, and then the lady in the front, please. Both of whom I trust will be very succinct.
Tom McCain, member of the Institute. I'd like you to say a little bit more about the point that you stressed, which was the importance of transnational Shia paramilitaries as drivers of conflict in the region. Where do you see this happening? You mentioned the Lebanon, but where else? And what are the motives of the sponsor states?
And then lady at the front, please.
As you can see, it's a lot of conflicts, a lot of wars. It's chaotic state. How you would advise what kind of international organization we can create to unify all nations, target peace, and to avoid this conflict and wars? It's much more intelligent to invest for beautiful life and civilized life, isn't it?
Okay, thank you. It's a short question, but not a short answer. Emile.
First, thank you for the question on the reconstruction of Syria and how that might be pursued. I think this is a very fraught topic because the potential for moral compromission, political entanglements is massive on this front. The argument is the following, is that, okay, the battlefield is clarifying, there is a relative victor, there is a massive humanitarian need, etc. The only way to have leverage today is to inject some money, put some conditionality, try to shape how this is happening on the ground. That's certainly a discussion that's happening in Western capitals at this point. I tend to be very skeptical, and that's an understatement about all this. Because first, don't do that because you think you're going to build leverage. Leverage doesn't come just from bribes. It also comes from a level of coercion and commitment. And there's still 500,000 Syrians who are besieged in Syria. I think 99% of them are besieged by the government. No coercion, despite UN Security Council resolutions, all this blah blah, the escalation, and there's no coercion. And so, the notion that giving money to Assad or through some reconstruction fund is going to give some leverage is really. It's a wonderful construct in the heads of some EU bureaucrats and others. When you know the realities of conflict, I just don't think it's going to happen at all. The other question is, what is Assad's vision of reconstruction? Because it doesn't necessarily meet what you, international organizations, other governments will define as reconstruction. Because there will be a level of forced displacement, sectarian cleansing. Who can come back? Are they going to come back to their villages? Are they going to? How do you provide for their own safety? So there's the risk that you build something for a certain population, but then you discover that population is not allowed to come back, or is shipped to some other remote corner of the country where they are left alone. I think the potential for moral compromission is massive because. Essentially, funding reconstruction the way it is talked about today is essentially subsidizing Assad's stabilization and counterinsurgency strategy. So after like pulling the plug on rebel groups, not intervening in 2013, all this saying we're going to get to the point where we're actually going to fund the guy. I'll write some of the nastiest op-eds to actually show the level, because this is going to have an impact in future conflicts that are likely to come. The notion. Now, the counter-argument, and that's something I accept, is, look, the humanitarian tragedy is massive. We have to do something about it. Okay, then do it because of humanitarian assistance, pump it up, but while consciously disregarding and accepting, that you disregard the second and third order effects of that thing. That you say, okay, all this is going to happen, but we're motivating by the immediate need. Because money is not going to, force Assad to distance himself, or compel Assad to distance himself from Iran, for instance. The time to do all this was a few years ago, when there were instruments, there were strategies to do that. At this point, there is none. So I'm very worried about it. Now, you're right. If you don't do it, you open the space for others, Russia, China, Iran, to do it. And they'll do it, they'll establish their infrastructure and so on. My point is, if we really care about the humanitarian assistance aspect of things, let's fund the current humanitarian programs in surrounding countries at the level that's needed. Let's start there, and try to enforce Resolution 2254 and others, but assistance inside the country, which is not happening because the Assad government is not given this green light. The UN has entered this entanglement with the Assad regime and is suffering massively. I recommend that you read the work of Renew Lenders or Emma Beals and others who have looked at this and show how over time you get sucked into the politics of Damascus, and you constrain yourself and you're no longer providing what you need to provide. But I do accept that there is a counter-moral argument that says, there are people who are suffering, so anything you can chip in at any cost is worth it. I don't claim to have moral superiority and all that, but I think it's a fundamentally moral question, not just a political and strategic one. Israel-Gulf relations. Look, there's certainly a convergence in terms of threat perceptions, in terms of wishes, preferences in the regions, and so on, and certainly like positive signals left. I just still don't think that you can operationalize that rapprochement. People talk about it. We know we can write papers about how they agree on issue A, B, C, and D. It's just politically very fraught. What you would want to do today, you could do it covertly, not publicly, if it's intel exchanges or technology and things like that. So I don't see a qualitative transformation in that relationship anytime soon. The Palestinian issue remains a very crucial, very sensitive matter in the Arab world. I don't think they'll be able to do that. And if they were to do something publicly, you can be sure that Iran, Hezbollah, Assad, and so on will use it and say, haha, we told you. They were always in league together, which is not the case, but they will have won that pure battle. Transnational Shia militias. Look, they're useful for a number of reasons. They're relatively cheap. They're relatively mobile. They're very mobile, sorry. Their activities are deniable. You go and say, yeah, but in Iraq, it's the Hashid who did that. It's not necessarily the Iranians and so on. Maybe Al-Khaz'ali or Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, and we know where they lived and who they report to, etc. But you do have that. When Qasem Soleimani shows his face across the region, it shows you to some extent, who's calling the shot. But they have all the right qualities for the Iranians. They are relatively cheap to field, and if you're going and recruiting Afghan, Pakistanis, etc., who are looking for salary, looking for residency permit in Iran, work permit, and whatever, it's even cheaper over time. So that's an important element. The cost of operation of Iran is minimal compared to the cost of operation of Saudi or any other actor. Like if you look at Iranian spending in Yemen on a yearly basis compared to Saudi spending in Yemen, I mean, it just doesn't compare. And again, but you're cultivating humans, you're cultivating individuals, you're building this over time, you're developing an ideological, organic link between all this. I mean, it's all from Iran's perspective, it's entirely right. Now, where would they operate? Well, against Iraqi Kurds, against Syrian Kurds, against the remnants of the Syrian rebellion, against, in Lebanon, you can do a lot of intimidation and get, Hariri, the Christian leadership and whatever, to cave, to understand who's the greater power, if they just have to show their muscle. Against Israel, on the border with Jordan. I mean, I'm just saying it is actually it's already a driver of conflict. It's going to be a driver of future conflict as well. And it's only now that I realize that. Now, I don't want to compare them straightforward to ISIS. I mean, I think there is a tendency in the region to do that. I think the strategic impact is huge, I mean, on regional politics. But there are there are fundamental differences between Sunni jihadis and Shia jihadis. And Shia jihadis recognizes the state, ostensibly, I mean, at least pays lip service to it. A Sunni jihadi is fundamentally rejectionist. A Sunni jihadi has international ambitions, will conduct terrorist attacks abroad, will boast about them and so on. A Shia jihadi is concerned with local control. I mean, it's not about doing stuff far away. Anyway, there was a time, very limited and so on, but that's it. A Sunni jihadi may be quasi-genocidal, like ISIS with the Yazidis and so on. A Shia jihadi wants to establish his hegemony, but is not genocidal. I mean, this is why Christian communities, other communities are accepting relatively of the Hashid vis-a-vis saying it's a very imperfect analogy. I mean, we can, debate whether my own use of jihadi is the appropriate one for these militiamen and so on. But I'm just pushing it. So I'm saying that there are big differences to account for. And finally, how to pursue peace. Put me in charge. No, I'm kidding. I just think that there is, as you said, there is chaos. I don't think that any institution that really has the credibility, the leverage at this point to do something. It's really conflicts to be managed rather than even solved at this point. I'm not despite my very young age, I'm not a very optimistic person. So apologies for this very imperfect answer.
Okay. Thank you. I'll bring it to a close there. If you would like to attend tomorrow's event with the Iraqi Chief Justice, please speak to my colleagues, either Lily here or Sheena at the back. Sheena, wave. Very good. All it leaves me now is to please ask you and joining me in thanking Emile.